It was a calm morning in a quiet town in California. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. Birds chirped on the telephone wires, and the streets were empty except for a few people walking their dogs. In a small, simple house at the end of the lane lived Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole, a man whose life had once been all about discipline, honor, and duty. Daniel was a Marine sniper, trained to stay calm in the harshest conditions, patient under pressure, and loyal to his mission above all else. He had served his country for more than a decade. With tours in places most people only heard about on the news, his service record was filled with medals, recommendations, and words like bravery and excellence. But behind all those honors was a man who longed for peace. After years of deployments, Daniel had finally come home to rebuild his life. He wanted quiet mornings, simple evenings, and maybe a chance to find out who he was beyond the uniform. He lived alone in that small house, fixing things around the yard, helping neighbors with repairs, and occasionally volunteering at the local Veterans Center. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, until one morning when everything changed. It started with the sound of cars pulling up outside his house. Daniel looked out the window and saw several police vehicles parked on the street. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. His heart raced, but his mind stayed calm, trained by years of service. Moments later, he heard heavy knocks on his door. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole?" A voice called out. Daniel opened the door, expecting maybe a visit about a misunderstanding or a simple check. But instead, several officers stood there, serious and firm. "Sir, we have a warrant to search your property," one of them said. Daniel was confused. "Search my property? For what?" "Possession of illegal weapons and restricted government items," the officer replied. Daniel's mind froze. Illegal weapons? Restricted items? That didn't make sense. The equipment he had, old rifles, protective gear, and documents, were all tied to his past missions. Some were gifts, others were things he had kept safely with permission during his last deployment. He tried to explain, but the officers were already walking in. They opened boxes, checked closets, and photographed everything. Neighbors began to gather outside, whispering and pointing. For years, they had known him as the quiet Marine who helped fix fences and shoveled driveways for the elderly. Now they watched in disbelief as he was placed in handcuffs. As the metal closed around his wrists, Daniel felt something heavy sink in his chest. He wasn't angry and just shocked. "I served this country with everything I had," he said quietly. "I would never do anything to harm it." But his words went unheard. The officers were following orders, and Daniel knew what it meant to follow orders, even when they didn't make sense. At the police station, Daniel sat alone in a small room. The walls were bare, and the light above his head hummed quietly. Memories from the battlefield flashed in his mind, not of chaos but of duty, of moments where he had been trusted with responsibility far greater than himself. He thought about his unit, the men and women he had led, the ones who had trusted him. He thought about the missions where every decision mattered, where a mistake could mean someone wouldn't make it home. He had carried that burden with honor. Now, sitting there, he wondered how his name had ended up on a list that labeled him as a suspect. The officers asked him questions about the items found in his home, certain rifles, documents, and specialized tools. Daniel explained that they were part of classified missions and that he had been instructed to safeguard them until official clearance came through. But his explanation seemed to make no difference. Without the paperwork to back him up, his words were just words. When they finally allowed him to make a call, Daniel reached out to his lawyer, Michael Harris, a man who had once served as a legal advisor to military families. Michael promised to come immediately. "Daniel," he said over the phone, "don't lose hope. We'll get to the bottom of this." But Daniel wasn't sure. He had seen enough bureaucracy to know how easily one man could be forgotten in a pile of misplaced files. News spread fast. Within a day, local headlines read, "Decorated Marine arrested in weapons scandal." Television anchors used words like mystery, betrayal, and shock. Neighbors who once smiled at him began to avoid eye contact. Some whispered that maybe the war had changed him, that maybe he had done something wrong. It hurt, but Daniel didn't blame them. People fear what they don't understand. He spent nights in a small cell staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The uniform that had once protected him couldn't protect him here. His medals, his years of service, his loyalty, none of it mattered. Michael visited him the next day with updates. "I've spoken to some of your contacts," he said. They confirm you were part of classified missions, but the problem is those records are sealed so tightly that even I can't access them without clearance. So how do we prove it? Daniel asked quietly. Michael sighed. We'll have to try to bring this to court. Once we do, maybe someone higher up will take notice. Daniel nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. He wasn't a man who gave up easily. He had faced worse odds in deserts and mountains far away. He decided that if this was another mission, he would fight it the same way, with patience, strength, and calm. The court case began a few weeks later. The courtroom was filled with people, reporters, townsfolk, even some veterans who had served with Daniel. He sat beside his lawyer, silent, focused, his face calm but his eyes tired. The prosecution presented their evidence, photographs of the items found in his home, official reports, and a long explanation of how dangerous it was to have such materials outside government control. Michael stood and spoke clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not a danger. He is a decorated Marine who served with honor. The items in question were issued to him during missions under classified authority. We are not dealing with a criminal. We are dealing with a hero caught in the gears of a broken system. But without documents or confirmation from the military, the words sounded like guesses. The judge listened but seemed unsure. Daniel sat quietly, remembering the code he had lived by. Honor, courage, commitment. He had never broken it, not once. But now it felt like that code had broken him. During one of the hearings, a reporter asked him outside the courthouse, "Do you regret keeping those items?" Daniel looked at the camera and said softly, "I don't regret following orders. I regret that those orders were forgotten." The clip went viral. Some people began to sympathize with him, saying it didn't make sense for a man with his record to suddenly turn dishonest. Veterans across the country began to write letters and emails standing up for him. Still, the trial continued. Days turned into weeks. Daniel's savings ran low. His once simple life was now filled with legal documents, hearings, and long nights of uncertainty. Sometimes he sat by the window of his small rented apartment, staring at the stars. The same stars he had seen overseas during long nights on mission. Out there, the stars had meant direction. Here they just reminded him of how far he had fallen. One evening, Michael came by with a quiet look on his face. "There might be someone who can help," he said. Daniel looked up. "Who?" Michael hesitated. "A retired general, Thomas Anderson. You served under him once, right?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. He was one of the best. Fair, strict, but always honorable. I reached out to his office," Michael continued. "No promises, but his assistant said he's looking into your case." Daniel didn't say much after that. But that night, for the first time in weeks, he slept a little easier. Somewhere deep inside, hope flickered again, small but alive. The next few days were quiet. The prosecution continued to press their case, and Daniel continued to sit silently beside his lawyer, listening, waiting. He didn't expect miracles anymore. He just wanted truth. And then one morning, something unexpected happened. A call came to the courthouse. The message was brief but powerful. "A representative from the Marine Corps will attend the next hearing." Whispers filled the hallways. Reporters speculated about who it might be. Some said it would just be a legal officer or a representative. No one expected what was actually coming. Daniel didn't think much of it. He had learned not to expect rescue. He sat quietly in his chair, hands folded, as the next hearing began. The judge reviewed notes, the lawyers exchanged documents, and the same dull rhythm continued. Until suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. The sound was soft at first, just the click of polished shoes against the marble floor. But it was enough to make everyone turn, and when they saw who walked in, the entire room fell silent. It was General Thomas Anderson himself, the 4-star general who had led missions across the world. Respected by soldiers and feared by bureaucracy, his presence carried weight not because of power but because of truth. Daniel's heart stopped. He hadn't seen the general since his last mission years ago. General Anderson walked toward the front, every eye on him. His expression was calm but serious, his steps steady, his purpose clear. At that moment, everyone in that room, the judge, the lawyers, the spectators, sensed that something important was about to happen, and Daniel, still seated in silence, felt something inside him shift. After months of doubt, of fear, of standing alone, when the courtroom doors opened, The sound was so soft that no one noticed at first. The air inside was tense, heavy with silence and judgment. People had come expecting to see the final chapter of a soldier's downfall. Few believed the truth would ever come out. Daniel Cole sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the floor. The once proud Marine, known for his steady hands and sharp focus, now looked tired and hollow. The uniform he once wore with pride was replaced by a plain suit borrowed from his lawyer. The lines on his face told stories that words never could. Stories of dust, danger, and distant battlefields. For months, Daniel had carried the weight of shame. Every newspaper headline, every whispered conversation in town reminded him that he was no longer the respected hero he once was. Even his own reflection felt like a stranger. His lawyer, a calm man named Michael Harris, leaned close and whispered, "Stay strong, Daniel. The truth has a way of showing up even when it's late." Daniel nodded faintly, but deep down he had already stopped hoping for miracles. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The room filled with a respectful hush. The trial had gone on for weeks, filled with confusion about missing papers, technical terms, and government protocols that even the experts couldn't explain clearly. The case was built around a few misunderstood items, weapons and documents that Daniel had kept safely after his missions overseas. They weren't his to own, the prosecution argued, but Daniel knew they weren't stolen either. They were part of missions so secret that even speaking about them could have been considered breaking orders. He had tried to explain, but each time the answer was the same. If there are no records, there are no exceptions. Now the moment had come. The judge picked up the papers and looked over them slowly. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole," she began, "you are accused of unauthorized possession of restricted materials. Before I deliver my judgment," but she never finished that sentence. The courtroom doors opened again, this time with a clear, deliberate sound. Every head turned toward the back. There, standing tall and calm, was a man in full military uniform, the kind you only saw in ceremonies or official events. His chest was lined with ribbons and medals that shimmered under the lights. The silver stars on his shoulders caught every eye. Gasps filled the room. A whisper spread like a wave. "That's General Anderson," someone said quietly. "Four-star General?" Daniel froze. He hadn't seen the man in years. General Thomas Anderson walked down the aisle slowly, his boots clicking softly on the floor. Each step carried authority, but also something else, something heavier, almost sorrowful. He didn't look at anyone until he reached the front. Then, turning toward the judge, he said, "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge looked surprised but nodded. "You may, General." Anderson straightened his back and spoke clearly, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "The man sitting before you is not a criminal," he said. "He is a Marine who followed every order given to him, including mine." A wave of murmurs ran through the crowd. Anderson continued, "The equipment found in Sergeant Cole's possession was issued to him during a classified mission under my command. The paperwork that should have cleared him was lost due to an internal error. That error was ours and not his." He turned to look at Daniel. "He risked his life more times than most people can imagine. And when he came home, he carried the burden of silence because loyalty demanded it. He could not defend himself without breaking his oath. That's what loyalty looks like, even when it costs everything." The judge leaned forward. "General Anderson, are you officially confirming that these materials were part of a sanctioned operation?" "Yes, Your Honor," Anderson said firmly. "And I take full responsibility. Staff Sergeant Cole deserves an apology, not a sentence." The room went quiet again. But this time it was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when truth finally finds its way through confusion. Daniel sat frozen, not sure whether to feel relief or disbelief. After all this time, after being handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a traitor, someone had finally said the words he'd been waiting to hear. General Anderson turned fully toward him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, in front of everyone, the general did something no one expected. He saluted. It was a slow, precise gesture, one Marine to another, one man to another. Daniel hesitated, then stood and returned the salute. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Some people wiped their eyes. Even the judge looked moved. "Sergeant Cole," the general said quietly, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I'm sorry. We failed you. You followed orders with honor, and we forgot our duty to protect yours. Daniel's voice broke as he whispered, "Sir, thank you." The judge cleared her throat, visibly touched. "All charges against Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole are hereby dismissed," she announced. "This court recognizes his service and his integrity." Applause broke out in the courtroom, soft at first, then stronger. Even some of the officers who had arrested him clapped, their faces red with regret. That day, Daniel walked out of the courthouse a free man. But more than that, he walked out with his honor restored. The sun was bright, and for the first time in years, he felt it warm his face instead of burning his skin. Reporters gathered around him, shouting questions, but he said only one sentence: "I'm just glad the truth finally came home." He didn't talk about revenge or anger. That wasn't his way. He had spent too many years learning that strength isn't in shouting. It's in standing still when the world tries to shake you. Over the next few weeks, news channels replayed the courtroom footage over and over. People called him the Marine who kept his promise. Veterans from across the country reached out, thanking him for showing that loyalty still had meaning. Schools invited him to speak about honor, duty, and courage. But Daniel didn't seek fame. Instead, he returned to the military base, not as a soldier on missions, but as a mentor. He began training new recruits, teaching them not just how to aim or move silently, but how to carry the weight of service with grace. He told them stories, not of glory or medals, but of responsibility and faith. Sometimes, he said, doing the right thing means standing alone for a while. But if you keep your head high, truth will walk back to you, even if it takes the long road. The young Marines listened carefully. Some had tears in their eyes. They could tell this was not just a man teaching skills. It was someone who had lived every lesson he shared. One afternoon, General Anderson visited the training field. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. Daniel stood at the edge of the field, watching the new recruits run drills. The general walked over, slower now, older too. "You've done well, Sergeant," he said softly. "They respect you," Daniel smiled. "They respect the uniform, sir. I'm just helping them wear it right." Anderson chuckled. "You still don't take credit, do you?" Daniel shook his head. "It's not about credit, sir. It's about making sure none of them ever end up where I did. Misunderstood and forgotten." The general nodded, his face serious. "You have my word. What happened to you will never happen again. We fixed the system that failed you." Daniel looked toward the horizon. "That means more than you know, sir." They stood there quietly for a while. Two men linked by a shared history, one who gave the order, and one who carried it out with unwavering faith. As the evening light faded, the general saluted once more before leaving. Daniel watched him go, knowing that apologies don't erase the past, but they do heal something deep inside. Years later, when people spoke about Daniel Cole, they didn't just remember the arrest or the courtroom. They remembered the man who stood through injustice with patience, who never raised his voice in anger, and who showed the world that true strength lies in calm dignity. His story was shared in classrooms, in military academies, and even in documentaries. But Daniel never saw himself as a hero. Heroes, he used to say, are the ones who keep doing their duty when no one is watching. In time, he retired quietly, living in a small house near the sea. He would often sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the waves move like a steady heartbeat, calm, powerful, and endless. Sometimes he would receive letters from soldiers he had trained. They told him how his story gave them courage, how they remembered his words during hard times. He kept every letter neatly folded in a wooden box. One letter said, "Because of you, I didn't give up. I remembered that the truth is patient." Whenever Daniel read that, he smiled. That was all he ever wanted, for his pain to mean something, for his story to give others hope. And so, the Marine who was once handcuffed walked into history, not as a man broken by injustice, but as a man who proved that even when the system forgets, integrity remembers. His journey became a quiet reminder that truth has its own rhythm. It may arrive late, but when it does, it stands tall, just like a soldier who refuses to bow to unfairness. Daniel Cole never spoke much about that courtroom again. But everyone who heard his story knew that somewhere between those walls, and in the steady heart of a soldier, justice had finally saluted back.